Yes, so I'd like to welcome everyone to our fall programming this year and the third part of a series on the laws of Kashrut and Jewish-Gentile relations by Dr. Shana Strauch Schick. As you may remember from last week and the previous weeks, Dr. Strauch Schick is a fellow of the Center for Israel Studies at Yeshiva University and teaches Talmud and halakhah at Michelet Mevaseret Yerushalayim and Matan in Israel and in the Drisha Summer Kollel. In 2011, she became the first woman to be awarded a PhD in Talmudic literature from Bernard Revel Graduate School at Yeshiva University, where she also completed an MA in Bible. She studied in the graduate program in Advanced Talmud at Stern College and has held postdoctoral fellowships at Bar Ilan and Haifa University. Her upcoming book, Between Thought and Deed, Intention and Talmudic Jurisprudence, examines the role of intentionality in the development of Talmudic law and is being published by Brill. And without further ado, Dr. Strauch Schick.
Thank you so much and welcome back. So those of you who are signed up, you received a new set of texts that we're going to look at today. However, we didn't finish our ones from last week. So if you still have those, please use those to begin with. I can share my screen if necessary. First, just to review what we have been doing. So we are talking about prohibition of Bishul Akum. And we were talking about when the prohibition of Bishul Akum does not apply. When are you allowed to eat the food cooked by a non-Jew? So we saw, first of all, any food that can be eaten raw, the prohibition would not apply to. So vegetables that are cooked, water, all that could be there's no problem of Bishul Akum. Food that is not served on a king's table. So in that realm, maybe a certain breakfast cereals, those not the kind of food that would be put out a big quit, or that if a non-Jew cooks such food, there'd be no prohibition of Bishul Akum, and hence it says it's not so relevant for living our day-to-day lives, but Kashrut organizations will give a halakhah to these kinds of foods. Back in the day, there was a day when Kashrut was not a very big stream. People had to rely on reading the ingredients. So we lived in such a time. This would be something to be aware of as well. Another thing we saw is if you have food to which Bishul Akum would apply mixed with foods that Bishul Akum would not apply, if there's more of the latter, then Bishul Akum also does not apply. So for example, we saw coffee. Even though coffee beans cannot be eaten raw, water can. And cooked. So even though the coffee beans are roasted by a non-Jew, if it's cooked by a non-Jew, since there's more water than coffee beans, that makes it a ta'aruvet, a mixture, and there's more of the non-Bishul Akum part than the Bishul Akum part, and that makes it a kosher as well. We also saw another possible leniency where it occurs in the house of a Jew. Now this one was less unanimous, and we saw multiple opinions about this. So we saw Rabbeinu Tam, the Tosafist, grandson of Rashi, rejected this as a source of leniency, whereas the Ravid allowed it. And he said, in this case, there's no fear of eating non-kosher food, and as quoted in Tosfot, there's no fear of intermarriage as well. But other texts see this difference of opinion between Rabbeinu Tam and the Ravid as a result of what is the reason for a Bishul Akum. If it's a fear of intermarriage, then it wouldn't help if it was in the house of a Jew. But if it's a fear of eating non-kosher food, then it will indeed help if the food is being produced in the house of or cooked in the house of a Jew. And we saw that this divide carried on between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, Rav Yosef Akaro of the Sephardi Shulchan Aruch versus Rev Moshe Israelis of the Ashkenazi Ramah as to how we hold in this matter. The Shulchan Aruch and generally was a lot more strict on it and said this is not a leniency that would help. And he says, now if the non-Jew making the food in your home is servants. Then he says there are those who are lenient. Now, even within that, the Ramban, Nachmanides said maybe that would only apply if the person was a slave and had no choice in whether they can make your food or not. But then he ultimately rejected that because he said the Shulchan Aruch didn't say that. And in terms of the Ramah, he said that if a non-Jew cooked the food in your house, after the fact, you can certainly eat the food. Whether you can tell a non-Jew to cook food in your home, lechatchila, is another matter. But he said, if the non-Jew in your home is a servant, then even lechatchila, you can have them cook the food for you. So, whether people rely on this or not, certainly there are differences of opinions. And what I would say that if you're at, I remember a few years ago, I was at a person's home and they had a non-Jew making the barbecue for them. And this person said to me, well, did you see a Jew turn on the barbecue or not? And, you would, first of all, we'll see. Whether that helps is not even unanimous, and that it's itself can be somewhat controversial. But even not, one could certainly rely on the Ramah in that case and eat the food if you're at a person's house and the food had been cooked by a non-Jew and a Jew had not been involved in the cooking process in some way. So certainly b'diavad, one could rely on the Ramah, and whether they can rely on the lechatchila as well. Certainly every case is its own case, and if so, someone has, someone watches their kids and they're not home to turn on the oven, and and they have to make that food for their kids. Could they rely on that? Certainly there's room to rely on the Ramah. Okay, now the reason the Ramah was lenient, he said, because so if everyone has the text, I can share it on the screen. So it's a little bit more complicated to do that. But so one of the reasons for the Ramah's leniency about why food that a non-Jew cooks in your own home is a kosher is he said that it's impossible that a Jew's not going to yechateh, it's not going to stoke the coals or stir the food, meaning a Jew will most likely be involved in the cooking process in some way. And that is the reason the Ramah allows us to rely on this leniency. So now we have to understand that leniency, that why does it help if a Jew is involved in the cooking process? So this is where we left off. We left off with, we saw a text from the Bavli, it was a fairly long one, about where a Jew gets involved with the cooking process, and that's where we left off. And it said, if either a Jew puts the food on the fire, and then a non-Jew flips it over, or a non-Jew puts the food on the fire, and a Jew flips it over, the food would be fine. Then it brought anecdotes, for Jew. Even the man puts the meat on the grill, and then he goes to shul or to the big midrash, and a non-Jew comes in and turns the food over. That's a fine. We're not concerned. And if a Jewish woman left a pot of food on the fire, then she either goes to shul or the bathhouse. I speculated maybe that's taking place in Bavaria, where the shul and the bathhouse were indeed next to each other. But while she's away, a Jewish woman comes and stirs the food. Again, we don't have a concern, and it would not be a problem of Bishul Akum. And then it brought a final case, which seemed to be about baking. And so we're in now the last line of that Bavli text that we started looking at last time. In the Gemara in Avoda Zara, hard thing to do, but it's in Avoda Zara, Lamechet Amud Bet, 38b. So the Gemara says as follows, and it's on the bottom of page 2, top of page 3 from last time. So the last two lines say that it's Marnami, it's the last two lines on page 2. Amar Rav Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan v'Amrei Le Amar Rav Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan Bein Shinei Chovei Kochavim V'Avach Yisrael. So whether a non-Jew puts the food on the fire and the Jew flips it over, or whether a Jew put the food on the fire and a non-Jew turns the food over, mu'atar. This food is allowed. It's fine. It's a kosher food. The food is only prohibited if both the beginning and the end, meaning the entire process, was done by a non-Jew. Amar Ravina, and then this is now at the top of page 3. Ravina says, and the halakhah is, the law is as follows. Ha rifta de shagar oved kochavim, and haven, that a non-Jew fueled, they put the wood in and lit it. The afa Yisrael, and then a Jew bakes in it. Inami, or shagar Yisrael the afa oved kochavim, or a Jew fueled it and a non-Jew baked in it. Inami, or shagar oved kochavim the afa oved kochavim. Or a non-Jew is the one who put the wood and fueled it, and a non-Jew is also the one who baked it. And what did a Jew do? A Jew came and stoked the coals. Shafir dami. That is okay. That is adequate. So if all a Jew did was stoke the coals a little bit, or in our day, maybe it would be adjust the flame or the knobs, that would be okay. That's not a problem of being cooked by a non-Jew. Now, I purposely didn't say a Bishul Akum, because the question is, what does this case refer to? Because as we see here, if you look through this Bavli text, throughout it referred to putting meat on the fire, or putting a pot on the fire. And when it referred to meat or a pot, then it said a Jew had to either mix it or put it on or turn it over. And only when it refers to hafa. And what does afa mean? It means to bake. And what does bake refer to? Usually bread. And the question is, when it says if you bake and it's adequate to just stoke the coals, does that only refer to when you're baking bread? Which, as we'll see hopefully later on today, is a lot more lenient, according to most opinions, than a Bishul Akum, than food cooked by a non-Jew? Or would this leniency apply to a cooking as well, and not just to where it's a case of a baking? And that's a dispute that we're going to see addressed by the medieval Rishonim. We'll see here it's a Tosfot now taking a more lenient position than the Rambam. So I think we began this a little bit last week, but I'll do it again now. So the Rambam said on page, then again we're on the top of page 3. So he writes in his halachot, laws ma'achalot asurot. He writes here in Parak Yud Zayin halacha tet zayin, dagim kitanim, small fish, shamachan Yisrael or akum, harihim k'moshe bashlu mixat bishul. So if a Jew or a non-Jew taught small fish, that's as if you've already begun the cooking process. So if a non-Jew goes and cooks it after the Jew has put salt on it, that's okay, because the Jew has done a part in the process. And as long as a Jew participated a little bit in the cooking, bein b'tchila, bein basof mutar, and it doesn't matter if the Jew cooked a little bit at the beginning or at the end, that food is allowed. You are allowed to eat that food. Lefichach, therefore, therefore, if a non-Jew puts meat or a pot on the fire, the hafach Yisrael, and a Jew turns it over, either turns the meat over, or he gis b'kedera, or the Jew mixes the food, and therefore hastening the cooking. Or it's the Jew who put the food on the fire, and then the non-Jew who completes it, either again by turning the food over or mixing it. Harei zemutar. That is okay. That's not a problem of a Bishul Akum. So when you're cooking, the Jew has to do a part in the process. What does the Rambam say with regard to pat akum by a bread? The Rambam is a little different. And there we'll see when we do pat akum, there he says it's adequate to just toss in straw to add to the fire, and even if it doesn't help in any meaningful way. So it's very clear that for the Rambam, for Maimonides, in order for a Jew helping in the cooking, for it to not be a problem of a Bishul Akum, the Jew has to contribute in a meaningful way, and not just in token turning the that wouldn't help for the Rambam for a Bishul Akum problem. Tosfos, on the other hand, disagrees. And the source after the Rambam, Tosfos on the Bavli text we saw before, on the line where the Jew comes and stokes the coal. So Tosfos here writes, Mikula shamatim mashma debainin sheyehe Israel mekarev habishul kitzat. So says Tosfos, when you read through this Bavli text, you read through this sugya, the feel is, or it applies, that a Jew does have to help in the cooking process. A Jew has to do an act that makes it a cook. However, Tosfos says, the halakhah and what people actually do here are not exactly the same. Uma shenahagu lehashlich kisem letanor, but he says, but in actuality, people act, the custom of the people in medieval Germany was to throw a straw into the fire. So what do? How can they do that when it goes against the clear peshat of the Bavli sugya? So Tosfos explains that somchim amar sheyesh bedrim shebein b'nei Babel leb'nei Eretz Yisrael. So they rely on this book, a post-Talmudic book, which gives a list of all the differences between the Jews who lived in Babel versus the Jews who lived in the land of Israel. Because there it says, Tosfos explains, the Kamar b'nei Babel mashlichim kisem letanor. So in this book, Tosfos writes that people in Babel would say that you can throw a straw into the oven and that helps. And that will take care of the Bishul Akum problem. Ubnei Ma'arav, whereas the people of the West, meaning people who live in the West, Israel, the people who live in the land of Israel, Omrim Kisem Zeh Ma'malem Ma'mori. What does adding a straw do? That does nothing. It's meaningless, and throwing in a straw to the fire will not help the Bishul Akum problem. So says Tosfos, Anu nimshachim achar b'nei Babel v'talmudam. So we rely on that. We rely on the people of Babel and their Talmud, who did rely on throwing a straw into the fire. So for the Rambam, in order for a Jew being involved to help with the Bishul Akum problem, the Jew must contribute to the cooking in a meaningful way. That's the view of the Rambam. We'll see the Shulchan Aruch goes with this as well. Whereas for Tosfos, you can throw a stick into the fire and that's adequate. And he says, they say maybe it's against the pshat of the sugya, but he says there is a halachic precedent for it in this book, which lists the differences between people who lived in Babel versus the land of Israel. And apparently at one point in Babel, people would rely on throwing a twig into the fire. And so any kind of act, even if it doesn't actually contribute to cooking, would be adequate to take care of the Bishul Akum problem. So going back to our when does the prohibition of Bishul Akum not apply, if the Jew is involved in the cooking. For the Rambam and for Sephardim, they'd have to be involved in a very meaningful way. I mean, it's not enough to just, adjust the knob on your oven. Whereas for Tosafot, and we'll see the Ramah, it is enough to do that. Even a symbolic action, which doesn't actually help the cooking at all, would take care of the Bishul Akum problem. And so, if you're at your house, you had a non-Jew cook for you, dispensing with this previous kula, you just, turn on the oven or adjust the flame. That's enough to take care of it being a Bishul Akum problem for Ashkenazim. Okay, so that is this dispute between the Rambam on the one hand and a Tosfot on the other hand. And as I mentioned last time, this leniency brought by a Tosfot, which it was, you could see it's kind of it's a matter of what does a text say versus what do the people actually do. And it seems in medieval Ashkenaz, Jewish people relied on non-Jews to cover for them, and it seems that many people have written about, likely due to the prevalence of non-Jewish slaves just all over Western Europe at this point. In Germany, there's a lot written about this, and just people relied on slaves to do their work for them. And the fact that often people didn't own their own oven, that's especially going to become relevant when we speak about pot oven, where there was one oven per a village, per town. And so people were not even in kind of a troll often of, being able to make their food. And again, that was much more so in the case of making bread than anything else. But this was just a Tosfot kind of fronting the reality of their life, of the lives of the people in their time, and not that they're looking for a halachic precedent, but certainly it seems that if we're relying on the Peshat of Bavli alone, this is not the way they would have gone. But this is what people do, and we do have a halachic precedent to rely on. And so therefore, a Tosfot goes with this leniency that the Rambam, as does not at all feel comfortable, does not even suggest as a possibility at all. Okay, now in the next source I brought for you, the Ran cites another Sephardi Rishon, the Ramban Nachmanides. And the Ran here writes, so those people, those seems Ashkenazim, who rely on throwing dig into the fire, Katav Haram Aban, this is Nachmanides. Nachmanides writes, Delo Mahani, this will not help. So it's like the Rambam, like Maimonides, the Ramban feels it's not going to help if you just throw a twig into the fire. However, writes the Ran, he then cites the Ramban some more. Hara zelashona. However, the Ramban also wrote, Dimaite Israel gechalim. If, however, the Jew didn't just throw a little piece of straw in, but actually brought the coals, umasim betoch hatanor, and put them in the oven, o betoch hapornir, or put in this very large oven, umehen madlikim et ha'esh, and from those coals that the Jew brought, that's what they then light. Efshar shehu mu'atar. Maybe if the Jew's the one who began the heating process, maybe that would help. So turning on the fire, maybe that does help. To Israel shagre lahu tanura, because in that way the Jews really fueling the oven. So I don't know if it's exactly parallel to turning on the oven. In this case, the Jew brings the wood from which the fire begins. If the Jew brings like most of the wood, then he's really bringing, or she's really bringing, the main source of the fuel, maybe that would be okay. So says the Ramban, it's not enough to throw a little straw in. You have to kind of attribute the main source of wood that's going to be used in heating the fire. So a token act would not be okay for the Ramban. So it's, a little bit of a leniency more than what the Rambam mentions, because the Rambam didn't even mention this much, but the Ramban does allow for the Jew fueling the oven to help with the Bishul Akum problem. And now let us just look to how the halakhah is brought down in the Shulchan Aruch. And as I note here, the Shulchan Aruch goes with the Rambam and the Ramah goes with Tosfos. So the Shulchan Aruch in Halakhot Machalei Oved Kuchavim Siman Kuf Gimel Sevav writes, Kol Shebishul Yisrael Ma'at Bishilo Ben Tchila Ben Basof Mutar. As long as a Jew cooks a little bit, it could be the beginning, it could be at the end, then it's fine. It's not a problem of Bishul Akum. So again, if a non-Jew puts the meat or the pot on the fire, and a Jew either turns the meat over or stirs the pot, or a non-Jew is the one who completes it, that is fine. Now, the Ramah here adds in a leniency. Afilu lo haya mitzvashel below siyua oved kuchavim. Even if the food would not have ever been cooked without the non-Jew either turning it over or mixing the pot, it's still okay. Now, if you recall from last week, I know it's been a long time, that's against what the Talmud said, but the Ramah is lenient. Even if the food would not have been cooked unless the non-Jew got involved, the Ramah is lenient and says that this food is kosher, and that is not something which everyone would agree with, but the Ramah, once again, is lenient in this regard. And the Shach points out that what the Ramah says is against what we saw in the Bavli last week. So in the next text, you have the Shach here writes, commenting on the Ramah, Afilu lo haya v'chule, l'chora kasha. What the Ramah writes is a question, Dehu neged hashat, because it is against what it writes explicitly in the Bavli. It goes against what it said outright in the Sugya and Avoda Zara that we saw. So how could the Ramah be lenient? How could he say that even if the food would not have been cooked, had the non-Jew come and turn the meat over or mix the pot, it's kosher, when that goes against what the Bavli says? So the Shach says what Tosfot says, Ela de Sanchinan, Amasha Katuv B'chilufei Minhagim B'nei B'nei Israel U'bein B'nei Babel. The Ramah too must be relying on that book that Tosfot mentioned, which lists the minhagim that are different between people who live in Israel versus people who live in Babel. And so even though it goes against the Bavli, which we have, we, just like Tosfot relied on that leniency, so too the Ramah is relying on it as well. And so again, Tosfot relying on leniency to allow a Jew to throw in a straw to help with the problem of Bishul Akum, and the Ramah will rely on this work to say that if a non-Jew, if the intervention of the non-Jew caused the food to be cooked, without which it would not have been cooked, that food is still kosher, not a problem of Bishul Akum. The Ramah's willingness to be lenient in that regard, also he is relying on this work about the minhagim between people of Babel and Eretz Israel. Okay, next halakhah in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch writes, Ein shigira hatanor mo'ela ela bepat. Lighting the fire only helps with a bread, says the Shulchan Aruch, like the Rambam. It will not help with a Bishul Akum. Aval b'shar hamitbashlim ein shigirat hatanor v'lo halakat ha'esh ma'aleh umorid. But when it comes to Bishul Akum, lighting the fire will not help. So also against Nachmanides. So the Shulchan Aruch is going like the Rambam, which is often the case. Rather, what's the only thing that will help? Ella hahanacha dafka. The only thing that will help is placing it there in the first place. if you want to cook in the oven of a non-Jew, then a Jew has to put the food into the oven in a place that it can cook. Meaning you have to be able, it has to be able to cook from what you did, and not based on what the non-Jew has does to it. Now again, the Rama jumps in here with a leniency. The Rama writes, Haga v'yesh chokim. But there are those who disagree with this Shulchan Aruch. Usvir lehu dehadlakat ha'esh o chitoy bagechalim mahani le'inyan bishul kemo le'inyan pat. Says the Rama, there are those who disagree with this. Yeah, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch might hold this way, but not everyone agrees. And there are those who hold that lighting the fire, or even stoking the coals, meaning adjusting the flame, does help with a Bishul Akum, just like it helps with pot, with the bread baked by a non-Jew. V'chein nohagim, and that is our minhag. That's what we do, says the Rama. Then, not only does this work, says Rama, even if you didn't even mean to adjust the fire, and you did it without the intention to be involved in the cooking process, that still works. That still helps take care of the Bishul Akum problem. And then he also says, Israel. And furthermore, there are even those who say that even if you didn't actually stoke the coals, and all you did is lo hishkrich sham kisei, and you didn't even throw it in the stick. Rak shakutim hidika esh me'esh al Yisrael shari. Even if this is even more lean, you lit fire A, then a non-Jew came and took from that and lit fire B, and then cooked over B. Even that would work. So the Rama really, allows even for the most minimal of an involvement of the Jew to take care of the Bishul Akum problem. Now, the Taz is not so comfortable with this leniency of the Rama, and like the Strauch, he too questions how the Rama could be so lenient when it goes against the Peshat, the plain text of the Bavli that we saw. And also, and again, he asked the same question, the last text on page number 3, Tamali. This is a wonder to me. Ha'ita behedya be-Gemara. This is like against the explicit Gemara that we saw. So he says, so Sarach Lamar, so you have to say the Hachikamar. You cannot read the Rama as it is, because that just cannot be the case, meaning the Strauch was willing to say that the Rama is against the Bavli, and he must be relying on the other text that the Tosfos does. But the Taz says, no, that's not the case here. Rather, you have to reread what the Rama writes, and this is what the Rama really means. This is what the Rama really means. What the Rama meant was it wouldn't have been fully cooked the way you wanted it to. It would have only been minimally cooked, which we saw that minimal amount of cooking that thieves would cook and eat on the run, which is a little step up from raw. And that's the minimal amount that if you cook on a Shabbat, you're liable for violating. And that's the minimal amount of cooking that you need to do without the intervention of a non-Jew. So that's how the Taz reads the Rama. So that's the first thing he does. And then he says also he limits the Rama's leniency to where it occurs in the house of a Jew. So go to the next 3 dots, and he writes, and it seems, according to my humble opinion, the inyan halakhah. So how do we rule? What's the halakhah? That you can only rely on the leniency of the Rama, of that you can throw in a stick if the food isn't adequately cooked. if it's in the house of a Jew. Because not everyone agrees with the Rama. Now we see that, and now we quote, because the Ravid had said that there's no problem. Remember this Ravid, that there's no problem of eating a Bishul Akum, if there's no problem of a Bishul Akum if it occurs in the house of a Jew. But Rabbeinu Tam Paligale. Now, even though the Rabbeinu Tam disagreed with that, so says the Taz, you can combine 4 and 5, meaning the kula of 5. So even though Rabbeinu Tam doesn't agree with that, if you put these two kulot together, then we can rely on that. So if you have being in the house of a Jew, and the Jew just adjusts the knob, then those would be okay. So we can't rely on either of those alone, says Taz, but we do rely on them together. So then he says, but if the food was being cooked in the house of a non-Jew, then you cannot be lenient. Rather, the only way it would not be a problem of Bishul Akum was in the house of a non-Jew would be if the Jew put the pot or the meat in a place where it could actually be cooked. And that's the only involvement a Jew could have. But this would not work in the house of a non-Jew, or maybe the premises of a non-Jew either. This debate between the Shulchan Aruch and the Rama continues in all these different areas of Bishul Akum. So moving on, since Seif Chet, the next halakhah of the Shulchan Aruch, he writes, Nach Yisrael Kedera Eish B'Salka. If a Jew puts food on the fire, uval v'salka, and then takes it off the fire, v'hechzira asor, and then a non-Jew puts it back on, that would not be okay unless it had already been cooked k'machav ben dirusai. And siftet, the last halacha we're going to look at, he writes in Bishul Oved Kochavim Machal Ben Drusa V'Gamru Yisrael. Now, if the non-Jew cooked the food to that minimal amount of cooking, Machal Ben Dirusai, and then Gamru Yisrael, then a Jew finished it, Yesh Asor. Some say that's not okay. Elam Kenu Erev Shabbat Erev Yom Tov, unless it's Shabbos or Yom Tov, and there'll be a great loss. So we will let you eat that food. Oshesh have said miruba, or you'll lose a lot of money if you don't allow this food to be eaten. And then the Rama ends off with v'yesh matirin b'chol inyan, and there are those who allow this in any case, even if you're not going to lose a lot of money, even if it's not Erev Shabbat. Then he brings a long list of people, and then he concludes v'chein no hagin, and that is our custom. And says the Strauch, v'chein haskamat rov haposkim, and this is the view of most of the poskim. This is how we rule, that we allow any leniency in a Bishul Akum to help. So even if it wasn't fully cooked, it was just k'machav ben dirusai, even if it wouldn't have been cooked unless the non-Jew got involved, even if all the Jew did was to throw a little straw into the flame or adjust the knob, that is all okay. That is the Ashkenazi Kisa. And even Sephardim can rely on this sometimes, as Rav Yosef and Rav Ovadia Yosef ruled in the last text I brought you in his Yechave Da'at, in his Teshuvot. He writes about Batei Malon, a hotel, umasadot, and restaurants, shebehem yesh mashgiach al Kashrut mitam harabanut, v'yesh lahem tudat Kashrut. So these are a kosher restaurants and hotels, but who's the one who actually makes the food? It's Arabs who actually make the food. And what does a Jew do? Hasagat ha'esh shel tanurei habishul va'afyan na'aseh al-yedei Yisrael. They're relying on the kula of the Rama. the Jew, the mashgiach, comes and turns on the oven. Why is that okay? I mean, that's okay if you're Ashkenaz, but Rav Yosef is writing for Sfaradim in this case, and he says, he writes Bisikum, and it's a long teshuva. I just gave you the highlights. He writes in the last two words here. He says, Yesh lana sfeik sefeika lehatir. There's a doubt here, and we could be lenient. What's the double doubt here? Shem halakhah kehaposkim hasorim shkam Bishul Akum hitru b'hesek shal yedei Yisrael. One doubt is maybe we hold like a toast of both, that you can rely on the Jew being involved with the fire in some capacity. Below rock a pot, maybe that doesn't only apply to bread. And what's the second doubt? And even if we say we hold like the Rambam, my Amaris, Shema halakhah maybe we also rely on this. Maybe we can also hold like the Raida that when it's in the house of a Jew, that's also a case. So someone asked us last week or 2 weeks ago, would that help in a restaurant? So says Rav Yosef, you have two doubts. And that's known as a fake, a double doubt. And in the case of a double doubt, we could be lenient. So, and says Rav Yosef, this is not only for Ashkenazim, this applies to Sephardim as well. As he writes, Bishul Akum in some Gam HaSephardim Ubnei Edut HaMizrach Yesh Lahem Al Ma Sheyismechu Lehitarech Uleachol Bebeit Malon Ubemasadot HaKesharim Al Yedei Hashgachat HaRabbanut HaMekomit. Even non-Ashkenazim can rely on these akulas and go to hotels or restaurants that rely on this, and just rely on a Jew turning on the oven, even though everything else is going to be done by a non-Jew. Even though the cooks are non-Jews, you can be lenient because a Jew turned on the fire. And again, maybe we hold like a Tosfot between the Rambam and a Tosfot here. And even if we hold like the Rambam, maybe we can rely on the Rav, and in the house of a Jew, it's okay. And therefore, there's what to rely on. And says Rav Avoda that even Sephardim could rely on this as well, and rely on this kula. And this is indeed a kula that is very much relied on, and many foods which have kashrut certifications rely on these akulas as well, as do many restaurants as well. So that is our completion of Bishul Akum. So in sum, we saw a lot. Saw that we have this prohibition against eating food cooked by a non-Jew, whether it's a fear of a social policy that it will lead to intermarriage and a more intimate level of mingling between Jews and non-Jews, or just a kashrut reason. If a non-Jew cooks a food, they may add non-kosher food to it. We saw the practical difference that arises between these two answers. And then we saw the various leniencies which were introduced with regard to Bishul Akum, both from the fact that this was already leniencies that were in the Talmud itself, and also because of the social realities of much time, especially medieval times, where many of the cooking was done by non-Jews. And often Jews did not have power or control over the use of the ovens, because there was one for everyone to use together. And again, that will become much more relevant in our discussion of Pat Akum. But it's very clear from many different areas of halakhah that in medieval Ashkenaz, non-Jews were doing much of the domestic work, and that led to many questions of halakhah with regard to Shabbat observance, checking for chametz, and of course this area of a kashrut as well, Bishul Akum. How can we allow the food of a non-Jew to be cooked? And we see the various ways that it's allowed. So always the case, if the food can be eaten raw, by definition, it's not a problem of Bishul Akum. If it's food that would not be served at a king's table, or a very proper formal banquet, it's also not a problem of Bishul Akum. If it's mixed with other foods which there's no problem of Bishul Akum and it's in the minority, it's also no a problem. If the cooking occurs in the house of a Jew, that's one leniency that some were willing to rely on. And if a Jew is involved in the cooking process. Now, whether, like the Rambam, that has to be a meaningful contribution that actually helps the food cook, or just a token kind of act where you throw a measly straw into the flame, or in our day, adjust a knob. We saw these two opinions, and the Rama was very willing to be lenient, like the Tosafot, and in all matters of Bishul Akum. Any minimal involvement that the Jew has in the cooking takes care of the problem of Bishul Akum. Okay. And with that, we have concluded our discussion of Bishul Akum. So it took 2 3/4 or 3/5, whatever time, but and there's so much more to say, obviously, and I just want to mention a few things that we saw when it talks about the kula, that it can't be served, that something has to be served on a king's table. One of the terms was, along with that, was served on a king's table, la lepetbo et hapat, to go with a bread. And from there, some say, oh, well, maybe it's only food that will be served with bread. In which case, that would not apply to food which is not served with bread. For example, desserts. So, based on that, some say maybe there's by definition no problem of Bishul Akum when it comes to non-main meal kinds of food. So, or d'herbes or desserts have no problem of Bishul Akum, even if it couldn't be eaten raw and a Jew wasn't involved and all that. Now, so maybe that would involve a cake. Now we're going to see in the next topic, well, what is cake? Is cake a Bishul Akum, or is it bread? Or is it more like pat akum? So we will talk more about a cake when we get to our next topic right now, which is pat akum. And so now we get to our next topic, which is in our same Mishnah. Our Mishnah in Avoda Zara listed a whole bunch of things that you can't have if they're produced by non-Jews. Again, not because they are inherently treif, but because they are things which the rabbis made prohibited because of these various reasons. So the next thing we're going to look at is pat akum, the bread of non-Jew that was made. So this is on the list. These are the things by non-Jews. Asurin, they are prohibited. They isurim isur hanahab, but they're not inherently prohibited. There's nothing like a treif about them, so you could get a benefit from them in other ways. So milked by a non-Jew that a Jew wasn't watching. And the next thing on the list is hapat, the hashemen shalahem, their bread and their oil. However, it says Rebbe ubeit dino hitiru hashemen. But Rebbe, that's Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi, and his Beit Din allowed oil. So they prohibited bread and oil, then ultimately allowed oil. So now we are going to discuss this prohibition of bread. So I will stop this share, and then I will share my other PowerPoint about pat akum, unless there's any questions about Bishul Akum. Okay, great. So pat akum. So again, we want to know what is the reason for pat akum. So here the Gemara has a discussion about this. So the Gemara, we saw originally that Rashi wrote, when he wrote his reason of intermarriage, he said that this was something that applied to every thing. That all these things that have been made prohibited is because of intermarriage. So okay. So let's look to source number 3 on the third source on this page. It says here, after the Rashi. Now we're in the Gemara in Avoda Zara, Lamed Vav Amud Bet. It says here, Geneva Mishmei de Rav Amar. Geneva in the name of Rav said, Kulam Mishum Avodat Kochavim Gazru Bahem. All these things were made prohibited because of idolatry. For when Rav Acha bar Ada came from Israel to Avoda, he said the name of Reb Yitzchak. Gazru al pitan mishum shemena. So they made a decree. They prohibited their bread because of oil. Now ask the Talmud, my oil made the shemen mipa. Why is oil worse than a bread? Why is oil the reason that bread is made prohibited? Ella, so don't read it what we just said. Rather say the following. Al pitam ushmanan mishum yena. Bread and oil were both made prohibited because of wine. But al yenan mishum benoteha. Now wine we get. Wine is a stronger thing. People drink, they become drunk, and it leads to kinds of behavior. And that was a direct result of benoteha, their daughters, to prevent marrying, to prevent people drinking together and getting to a close, and then ultimately leading down the road to enter a marriage. But al benotehem. Now, what's so bad about marrying non-Jews? We never said why is that a problem. That's mishum tavar acher. That's because of another matter. What's the other matter? Rashi explains. Enter a marriage is the avodat. The tavar acher is avodat elilim, idol worship. If you enter a marriage, there's a good chance that you will come to do idol worship. You'll leave Judaism and halakhah. And the al tavar acher mishum tavar acher, and that is because of another matter. Now Rashi here writes, it doesn't say there's another thing what that is, and and that's going to be a longer discussion elsewhere. Okay, but anyways, again. Here, the Talmud explicates that bread is not a problem on its own. I mean, bread is made usually from kosher ingredients, except here in Italy, where they have, lard stuff to it. But bread is made from flour and water, and so there's nothing wrong with a non-Jew making the bread in its own right. It's because of what it would lead to. And it's even that is not because we are nervous you would enter a marriage if you ate bread together, but it's because then you might have wine together. And if you have wine together, then you might mingle. Then you might marry each other, and then you might, for sake halakhah and Torah. Okay. So that's the prohibition. Now, the next question is, we see that bread, what is bread? Bread is food that you bake. Now, if I were to ask you if a Bishul Akum is prohibited, if you can't have the food that's cooked by a non-Jew, would you consider the fact that you can have a bread baked by a non-Jew? Of course not. Bread baked is the same thing as food cooked by a non-Jew. And the question is, why do you need two prohibitions listed in the Mishnah? If we said shilakot is prohibited, then of course their pots, their bread is prohibited as well. And the question is, are these really just two of the same prohibition, both coming from a Bishul Akum, or are these two different prohibitions? And why does that matter? Well, we saw that there might be differences in the halakhah regarding a Bishul Akum on the one hand and pot akum on the other hand. Also, it's a wonder as to why these were listed as two separate categories in the Mishnah. If they are just the same prohibition, why does the Mishnah list Bishul Akum on the one hand versus Pat Akum on the other hand. And why not just say Shilako? And we would know automatically that comes to include a Bishul, a Pat Akum as well. And the difference would be the case we saw in the Bible we saw earlier, before, where does it help to stoke the coals? Because that case was only said in regard to a baking. And based on that, we saw the Rambam say, well, that must only apply to Pat Akum, but it would not apply to a Bishul Akum. And therefore, it's clear that for the Rambam, a Bishul Akum and Pat Akum are not one and the same. These are two different halakhot. A Bishul Akum is one Zara, that's one prohibition, and it's more strict. The Jew has to actually be involved in the cooking a process to make it lenient. And Pat Akum is another halakhah. That's its own gezerah, and that has its own halachot to it, where he'll say even a token act on behalf of the Jew would be adequate. And that's why for the Rambam, these are listed as two different isurim, two different categories in the Mishnah. Pat on the one hand, and hashlakot, food cooked by a non-Jew on the other hand. So that's the view of the Rambam. Our time has seen us come to an end, so next time we will see the Ran has another way to read why Pat Akum and Bishul Akum are listed as two different categories in the Mishnah. And he gives two different reasons. One is that actually these are the same prohibition, and the only reason they're not listed as one is because they were made at two different times. So it's a historical reason. So really they have the same halachot. There's no difference between them. But then he gives another reason, which is actually bread baked by a non-Jew and food cooked by a non-Jew are actually not one and the same at all. They have very different halachot. And as opposed to the Ran says Pat Akum, the bread baked by a non-Jew, is much more severe and strict, machmir, than food baked by a non-Jew. And I see a question on the chat. Does that mean other foods baked by non-Jews? Well, we're going to talk about, what about other categories of food that are baked? And that generally is a category known as pat hababe kisnanin, which is things like a cake and cookies. They're food which are baked, but they're not exactly like a bread. And this has other relevance for other halachot as well. For example, do you wash on a cake? Would you bench? Would you say birakat hama'azon on cake and pan cakes and a pizza? So I'm sure you know or maybe you've heard that there are different opinions. Do you wash on a pizza or not? So maybe you've heard, well, some will say it's based on how much you eat. Do you eat one piece, then maybe you wouldn't wash because you're not making a whole meal out of it. But if you had multiple slices of pizza, in that case, you would wash and say birakat hama'azon, because in that case, you are making a whole meal out of it. And that's because a pizza is another example of this category known as pat hababe kisnin. It's a bread-like, but it's not exactly bread. And the question is, so what is the status of pat hababe kisnin? Is it like bread, in which case the leniencies, because most of us do follow, most posts can go with the view that pat akum is more lenient than bishul akum. So is pat hababe kisnin, a cake, cookies, what have you? Are they like pots, in which case laws of pat akum will apply? Or are they like a bishul akum, in which case we are more strict and you need the involvement of a Jew in some way? Also, as we're going to see, pat akum, although we'll talk about next time, we don't actually hold a pat akum. We do eat pat akum. 10 days out of the year we do not, and those are the few days we just left. Asari make shuba. There's a custom to not eat pat akum during the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So if this applies to Pad Habab Kism as well, can I eat and Dunkin' donuts or Entenmann's, or any non-Jewish brand baked good during these days? So we will discuss all that and more. I don't know if we're going to talk about Kism next week. We'll have to see. But we're going to get to this next week and the week after. So thank you all so much. You're always welcome to send questions. And yes, can't wait to continue our now new topic of Pat Akum next week. Have a wonderful week, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Strauch Schick. Thank you for the sneak peek to our next class. And to everyone who joined today on Zoom, Drisha Live, and Facebook. We are going to continue Drisha's fall programming tonight at 8 p.m. with the final part of a series by Rabbanit Leah Sarna called Kvod Hamet and Kvod Habriot, the Honor of the Dead. In addition to this one, we have many more classes happening right now. You can find out more information and find the registration links at www.drisha.org/classes. And again, this is a reminder that you can always find our recorded classes on the website as well at www.drisha.org/online-learning. Again, thank you everyone for joining, and I look forward to next week.
Thank you so much.